So I'll begin. Okay, now there we go. Got to get used to every system. So what is it? We're looking at actor network analysis. Actually, it's become a very robust science. There are a lot of entities and labs that have developed methods for doing basically link analysis, network analysis, to social network analysis. And it can get pretty complicated with algorithms, as you will hear about later on in the presentation. In essence, what we're trying to do is to map the relationships between people, groups, and other entities. You're looking for how do they connect, and how does that tell us about, what does it tell us about their organization, their capabilities, and what they're likely to do, and more importantly, who to target, what to focus on, who matters and who doesn't, and where do you put your resources as an intelligence officer. It also then reveals patterns and interaction amongst these people, things that you may not have realized were going on. Gives you leads as to how to do your collection, do your analysis. So in intelligence per se, what we've done is really looking for the crucial relationships that you need to isolate. Who really needs to talk to whom? What conversations would you like to listen in on? Who is going to be responding or reacting to what is going on? What's really helpful is that it shows you what the entire network is and allows you to visually kind of track the network and analyze the network. And I'll give you a bunch of visuals on that pretty soon. Lastly, one of the reasons you're doing it is if you understand the network, you have a good map of what's there, then you can anticipate what's going to happen within that network. So it allows you then to predict behavior and to track, like, for example, where a decision is in the process. Where are people going? Who's talking to whom? How does this work its way forward? So the fundamental of just mapping a network is that you identify your nodes, and generally they're people, and then you look at how they relate to each other. And you have your linkages, and you do that by drawing lines. And you can have lines with arrows on them or not. You can label the line, but you really start putting together a map of who counts and who do they talk to and what's going on. So here's a simple example of a network. And you have a bunch of people in the network. You can see that you've got different people have different access. Others are kind of outside. And what we do with network analysis is we look at the 3 different measures: degree, betweenness, and closeness. So as you see here, we say Andre interacts with Carol, but not with Ike. So you know who they're talking to and who's connected. But you got no connection, like Jane is out there on her own, and maybe is that because she's directing the network, or is she someone who's just a supplier or a supporter? You know, what is it? So you'd ask yourself, what is a connection, and why is she not connected with anybody else? When you take a look at Diane, and you say, well, obviously she knows she's at ground central. She may be the most connected, but that's what we're going to talk about next. So in degree centrality, you've got Diane as the connector in the network. She's connected to almost everybody except the people here on the far right. So you know that that's someone that you really want to pay attention to. Between centrality, here we're looking like at Heather. She's like a gateway. So she's either interpreting what's going on over here, or she's the person that they need to go through in order to get inside. And Heather could also like be the branch chief, and these are people who work for her. So you need to identify not only the connection and look at the centrality, but also maybe develop the role. But as we say, this is an important person because she's a bridge. She determines who gets to talk to whom. Then closeness. So who is closest to everybody else? You know, who's the shortest pass? So Fernando and Garth are there, and they're they could be very significant people, or they could be highly influential within the network because you can see what's going on. They've got visibility into a lot more than other people do. So those are the 3 basic measures that we're talking about. So how do you describe different kinds of networks? A centralized network will be like a hub and spokes. You have one or central node, and then everybody else goes out from the central node. A less centralized network has no single point of failure. A good, less centralized network these days is Antifa in the United States, where they organize over the internet. They have no assigned leader. and they show up and demonstrate and they do things. Whereas a centralized network, we go back to Al-Qaeda, and you'll be hearing a little bit about that from Cindy as we do our later presentation. Networks have horizons. You're one or two steps beyond the core players. How far out do you want to go? How widespread is the network? And how far does the information flow? And then boundary spanners are going from one group to another group. And what I think those are actually particularly critical, and that's a role that you might play within a network, that you're working in one group, but you're also trying to translate the information and the knowledge of one group to another group. But the other group could have a very different culture. So a boundary spanner's got the job of taking information from one group, deciding how to translate it and send it to another group. For example, it could be at a higher degree of classification to a lower degree. It could be someone who really wants a lot of detail, or they want just one paragraph. What do you send? How do you send it? So you really work there as a translator or a boundary spanner. So now just to show you how this works, we took a very classic case of the 9/11 hijackers and put together the 17 who were captured, who were involved in the plot, not captured, but who were involved in doing it. And then they start running some networks and some analysis of what is the path length, who's separated by how many steps, and who's the bridge, who really matters. So here you've got Muhammad he's got himself connected to 3 different networks, and he seems to be the most critical player in the game. So then if you take a look again, you're looking at meetings. So we've added, meetings and other things that are happening. So as you put in the meeting lines, you start seeing relationships and who's talking to whom. And here we can see that the pilots formed their own little clique where they were talking to each other. And that would help you then identify who the pilots were. You may have known about 3 of them now, or 4 of them, but now you got the whole group, and you can go from there. Then you add accomplices, it starts to get really big. And this is where people that will be talking to us later on will show you and tell you how they can look at these maps and they can derive a lot of analysis from the maps as to what's happening. Here you can see that Atta is right there at the ground central. He knows what's going on. He is must be the ringleader, and he scores really high on all the levels that we talked about. As you go out, you see the rest of the core group down here. You see how they group, and in fact, we'll show you a much better slide. This is getting into a more sophisticated analysis, where you can look at the boundary spanners with the red lines, and you see what's going on. And here you've got different groups. You've got the Hamburg group, the San Diego group, a Miami group. So you can continue to annotate this and do the analysis and figure out, with a chart like this, you can figure out who's talking to whom and what is really going on. And you can basically map the entire dynamic. And that gives you tremendous insight into not only what's happening, but also who you want to target, where you can get the best information, who's most critical to the process, and who do you have to pay the most attention to. So what does that analysis tell us? What we saw was that it was a fairly sparse and decentralized network. The hijackers were isolated. I mean, I remember getting a briefing from the FBI where they said, well, why didn't you see these guys doing something? I said, well, as we looked at the group of people, we realized that there was a group, and they had identified several key characteristics of the group. And they didn't know that they were a terrorist group yet. They said they tended to have group housing where 2 or 3 of them lived together. They tended to get a major amount of money come in once a month from a sponsor or from somebody. They had very little use of the credit cards except when they were doing very specific purchases. And they had 1 or 2 other indicators. And they said, well, who does that look like? What can we say about this group? And the best match that we came up with was college students. So they really had almost a perfect parallel pattern of what you expect in a normal college student, where they will live together in small groups, that they get money from mom and dad once a month, a big check comes in, then they kind of dribble it down and they need another big check. So we're saying all we had to do was to go back and check out all the college students to see if any of them were terrorists, and we could have been ahead of the curve and we could have avoided the disaster. So the Bureau actually had a pretty good case for saying they had a really tough problem to deal with. So if it's decentralized, it also means that it's a very robust network. where there's no single point of failure. You can't just take out one person and you've taken down the network. It also shows that there's a leadership structure, that people were in talking to each other. Ada was the leader, but he also had an ability, and there was other ways to connect within that group. So also, there was a overlap between skill sets, and it made the network vulnerable. The pilots in particular were absolutely critical. So if you lost a pilot, you would have lost that entire part of the cell. And looking at the network analysis, you can see where that was probably true. So what are the things that cause trouble if you're doing good network analysis? Well, the first thing is, do you have all the data? Are there people out there that you don't know about that need to be put in and could have really significant links? So you're always frustrated that you don't know if you've caught everybody, you have everybody included. Another thing is we call it fuzzy boundaries. How far out do you send the network? Where are you losing viability for doing the analysis? How do you determine who do you put in and who you don't? I mean, you can have someone who's got a lot of connectivity with Joe, but it turns out that he's talking to Joe because he's his landscape gardener. And it doesn't help you much to know that he's in the network. He's not going to contribute to the analysis. We're saying generally you look for short paths because it shows a lot of connectivity. But again, like Joe the gardener, you may have a very short path, but it has no meaning. So you have to be careful not to impute a lot of expertise or a lot of knowledge and insight into what's going on. We generally assume the peripheral players aren't important because they're out on the periphery, but they could be critical. They could be the person who provides the guidance to the group. And then also, what's really frustrating is that it takes a lot of time and energy to build these networks. Once you have it, you kind of go with it. And you don't realize that they're dynamic and they can be changing form and shifting, and people could be dropping out, and then trying to maintain it can be a challenge. We're teaching a class at CIA on network analysis, and it was right over the Christmas vacation. And we told everybody, they kind of knew each other, and they're going off for a couple of weeks of Christmas vacation. They came back in to continue the class. So when they came back in, we went to a network analysis mode, and we said, okay, everybody go up to the whiteboard, put your name on the whiteboard, and draw a line from you to somebody else in the class. If you actually saw them over the holidays, draw a line. If you just talked to them over the cell phone, just do a dotted line. And we're going to build a network analysis of the class and see what's going on. So we put together the network analysis. We stood back, we looked at the board, and Joseph was over here on the right-hand corner, and he had one dotted line to him over the entire 2 weeks. And we're saying, well, obviously Joseph is very antisocial, and he's really not part of the group. And we can do a great network analysis on why Joseph is not integrated. He must have come from somewhere else. And then Joseph raises his hand. Well, you don't realize that I went skiing at Whistler, and I was on the top of a mountain, and I wasn't talking to anybody for 2 weeks. And it turned out he was a very close friend of everybody in the group. But until you get the content behind the story, you can make some really big mistakes in terms of doing your analysis. Another thing, oops, I went ahead, pitfalls. Another thing is knowing when not to use it, when it's not an appropriate tool. And again, if you have a hammer, the best thing to use with a nail. Maybe you don't have a hammer and you don't have a nail. You need to find a different tool or a different technique to do the work you're doing. Some of my final observations. If you move down this road, you're actually doing a major investment of your time and energy, and probably also a lot of software. So getting into the software, using the software requires a learning curve and some training, and to get comfortable with it and knowing what it can do and what it cannot do. You need to know that the time spent is going to save you time down the road, that you can't get there from here without using this kind of a tool, and there's not an easier technique or a better way to do that. I always say that no structured technique and no software should ever be put on an analyst's desk unless you can guarantee to the analyst that it saves them time, it doesn't make more time. So if you find yourself building these elaborate networks and you're getting marginal results as a result of it, you've just lost a lot of very valuable time, and you don't want to do it. So you have to be sure that you're getting value in terms of time as well as quality of analysis. Next point, you were really trying to inform the analysis, but they are not the analysis. We have the same issue when I talk to people about using ACH or even a key assumptions check. That's all very valuable, but it's not the analysis itself. These are all thinking tools. They're thinking aids. They help you look at what's going on. But if you're not directly involved in the process and looking at what is important to do and how to process it, asking yourself critical questions and processing it very carefully as independently of the software, independently of the networks, then you're going to get yourself in trouble. Generally, people say, well, if I'm going to use a structured technique like a network analysis, do I put it in the paper? And the question is not if it's going to drive how you've organized the paper. I'm much happier seeing people put it in as an appendix. Say, if you really want to know how I got there, here's the map of what happened. And I can go back, if you're wondering about X, Y, or Z in my analysis, I can go back to the appendix and I can show you why I came to that conclusion, because this is how I rated the variable. This is how we scored it. This is what we included or excluded, etc. So you can show what it's your backup. It's saying this is how I did the analysis and how it informed me. But when it comes to actually writing the paper and doing it, I would think it makes a lot more sense to tell them what you learned from the process. Don't show them the process, because number one, they're trusting you to rise above the data and tell them what really matters. So if you have a crisply written paper, you're going to have, this is my key findings, this is the information I'm using to support it, and you're going to go through with a good topic sentence approach and show them what your line of argumentation is, and then persuade them that you're right. If they don't want to believe you, then they can go back to each step of that argumentation and challenge that, or challenge the evidence that you used to support that line of evidence. But you need to be able to have that, and that should really be independent of any tool or technique that you're using, because the tools and techniques are there to help you develop the line of analysis, to feel confident that you don't have data that's contrary to your findings, there's no inconsistent data to your hypothesis, or that you've considered multiple hypotheses, and you can put them out, but you don't really make it the analysis as you go forward. And then I would just note that you are able to use network analysis. What's really helpful is to start off with like a key assumptions check. What do I know about this group? What do I know about what's happening? What am I assuming? And is it valid or not valid? If you have a major assumption that this is working within one entity, and you challenge it, you say, well, maybe there are other elements to this group and I haven't thought about it. Again, if you can build your mindset broader as you go through and use some of these techniques is helpful. Another technique that we developed working with the Defense Intelligence Agency was a red hat analysis, which says this is what I think is going on. But if you put yourself inside the network, you say, if I am that Diane, how am I actually operating? How am I thinking? Do I have too many people I have to deal with and I make really quick and fast decisions, or do I have time to reflect, or who am I connected with the most? You can use the red hat analysis tool to really put yourself in their shoes and see if do they see the network the way you see it, or are they probably operating on it? And there's a question of their connectivity and what they're doing. What I like to use the example with red hat analysis is if I'm going to be a foreign spy and I'm going to have a handler. The question is, we would do analysis of we think this person may be a spy. We think they may go to Bogota. It's a good place to meet a Russian, where they're going to go to Dubai, because there's all kinds of people in Dubai. And so we'll come up with an analysis of what they want to do. But if you say, I am that person, their cousin is in Odessa, they're going to Odessa. And they're going to go check out. And we would have never thought of that, because it makes no sense to us unless you know that that's where their family is. And they have a reason, they have cover, and that's where they can go meet somebody, and it makes a lot of sense. So the red hat analysis can be really helpful in trying to build your network out. If you think about the individuals that are in the network and who and what they would be talking to and what they need and what they require. And I guess the other technique I like to talk about is we have a circle boarding technique. Some of you may have done starbursting, which is the who, what, why, when, where, and how. And what we try to do with circle boarding is to say, instead of trying to ask the questions, who's going, which is what starbursting does, which is actually a very valuable collection tool. What do we need to know? What are the questions that are most important to ask? You can also, if you're doing a network analysis, do the cheaper version, which we call circle boarding, which is what are the answers to the questions. So you say, well, if I'm looking at this network, I'm looking at this phenomenon, Who am I looking for? That's the obvious question. But what are they doing? Which could maybe give you some other ideas for who they may be in contact with to do it. When are they having these meetings, and have these things shifted over time? What are the connections, and how stable are the connections? So you go through, why are they doing it? What is motivating them? And if they're talking to these people, who else do they need to talk to in order to accomplish what they're trying to do? So you can kind of work your way around the starbursting star or the circle boarding, and come up with a much more robust set of questions and potential nodes that you want to look at as you do the network analysis. So, key takeaways, because I wanted to give a lot of time to our practitioners to talk about how they use this and what they do. The first thing is you use it to connect the dots between people, groups, or other entities. When you start using the technique, you can use squares and circles and rectangles to help you just know what kind of a dot you're dealing with, whether it's an entity or a person or etc. And it's a good, well, it also is very useful to use computer support, because if you write it down on a piece of paper and you change your mind and you need to start moving nodes around, you're throwing away a lot of paper as you redraw it all the time. So if you can just use the software, it's going to make your life a lot easier. What I like is that if you're building the network, you need to be very conscious of what are the gaps in the data. What are your collection sources? What are they able to tap into? Are there parts of this network that you know that you probably don't have access to, so they're not in the network? Can you build a little shadow network saying these are the things that may be there, but we don't know, and we haven't been able to validate that yet? Or this is collection guidance. This is where we need to go to try to see if there are gaps we need to fill for what's there. So you're looking for the gaps. And also you're looking, if you see a node, you see a connection or a short path, how do you know what's really going on in that relationship? Is there a way to, well, obviously you'd like to just get some SIGINT or find something that tells you this is the messages, this is what they're talking about. But if you have a high volume, you have to, again, the question is, can you get intel that tells you what is going on in that network, in that pathway, and how important is it to what you're doing? What I like is that you can actually use something like this tool, and you can actually hand write a network, put it in with a little PowerPoint, and you're done. And you can make a very important case. I would recall we were doing some work for a very large bank looking at money laundering networks. And they were they're looking at one entity. So they built a little network chart saying, well, here's the entity, here's the holding company above them and what they're doing. Here are a couple other entities that are also reporting to that holding company. And it turns out that the one on the left has already been taken down as a illicit enterprise. The one on the right is under investigation. And now we're looking at the one in the middle. What does that tell us about the one in the middle? So we probably are onto something. And so you have a little, and then you had a couple other players in the package as you looked at the network. But you could then take that little graphic, pop it on the front of the paper, and the customer, which would be the head of the bank, look at, do we maintain an accounts with these people or not? Boom, they've got a very powerful mini graphic that says, this is the network, we understand the network, and we know that we're comfortable taking an action and doing something. So even if you have a very simple chart, it can be very helpful in your presentation just to illustrate, what your line of argument is. It can actually capture the entire paper in one little picture. It's kind of like a mini infographic. So, and they're very powerful on the presentational side of the business. And then lastly, the software packages can get pretty sophisticated. And again, you can use them. They can be very helpful both for the visualization packages, but also the computational packages. And the thing is that not to get caught up in the algorithms, and don't trust know what the data is being crunched. It always concerns me that you get an answer, you get an algorithm, and you get a result. And you say, well, in order to make that calculation to come up with that result, what data do they need? And is all that data in the corpus of the evidence we have, or is some of it missing? So if you're asking a question and you know that they need this kinds of information to answer the question, and not all of it is present inside the database, then you got to be careful about whether you got a good answer or not. And that's a question a lot of people don't ask themselves. they've got the tool, they work the tool. If they don't like the answer they got from the tool, then they go back and tweak the algorithm to see if they can get a better answer. When you start going down that path, you're going to be in trouble, because this is just not going to be very helpful. So I think that will wrap me up. If you have questions for me, you can go to our website, or you can go to think@globaletica.com, and I can respond to what's going on. I may not get to it the same day, but I'm willing to do it. As you heard earlier, we do put out a bunch of books. The network analysis that we're giving here is captured, a lot of it's captured in the Structural Analytical Techniques book. That came out in January as a 3rd edition. And you can find a lot of other textbooks out there that focus heavily on network analysis. We also have a quick user's guide, the Handbook of Analytical Tools and Techniques, which also came out just a year ago. And it has a chapter on network analysis. So I think I'll end up there and turn it back over to the host.